All right. Morning, everyone. All right. So, can everybody hear me? Excellent. What was that comment I missed here? Oh, yes. Direct message from Courtney. Yes, that's a mistake that I actually meant to bring to everyone's attention. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, on the course outline, I accidentally indicated that for that Monday we would have class. We actually don't because it's, of course, Thanksgiving. So there is only one class that week. So I will correct that course outline and upload a corrected version. So apologies for that. Now let's share the screen and get started on some more about skepticism. Let's see here. So last time we covered Rene Descartes' skeptical arguments. So I think what we should do is just a quick bit of recap. What am I doing? All right, that's what I'm doing. So we'll just start with a little bit of recap, and then we'll move on to discuss David Hume, who has a sort of different set of concerns than Descartes had. So I'll get myself out of the way here. So just by way of recap, last time we looked at two skeptical arguments, which can be found in the Meditations. The Meditations is the short form title of Meditations on First Philosophy, by the way. And as I think Crumley is correct to point out, Descartes was not really a skeptic himself. Not in the sense, not in the sense of being like an academic skeptic or a global skeptic. But he did want to formulate and respond to the strongest skeptical arguments that he could think of so that he could be certain in his knowledge. And of course, the first argument deals with knowledge from sense experience, and that is the dream argument. Yeah, I want to make sure everyone can hear me properly. Yeah, I'm not sure what the issue would be there. Um, yeah, we can hop back and take another look at the infallibility slide. Whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Why don't we do that real quick right after we finish this slide? So remember the dream argument. The idea there is to show that what our senses show us is not the way the world really is. It's not really about our senses occasionally deceiving us. Rather, the argument is more about it's sort of concerned with the idea that you've perhaps formed belief on the basis of dream experience. Maybe that there is a philosophy book on your desk. Maybe you're having a dream like that. But of course, there is no actual object that is the philosophy book on the desk, right? There are no objects, real objects out there in the world causing that experience. Something internal to you is causing that experience. That's the dream argument, right? It's meant to show that in dreams you can be mistaken about the causes of your experience, and sense experience is a lot like dream experience, so we should doubt our sense experience as well. The second argument is, of course, the demon argument or the evil genius argument, and that is meant to show that you could be deceived about, about rational truths, right? A supremely powerful, malevolent demon could convince you that 2 plus 2 equals 4, even if it doesn't, or that triangles have 3 sides, even if they have other numbers of sides, right? But this demon could deceive you all that he wanted to. The one thing that Descartes thinks he can still be certain about is that he exists, because if somebody is being deceived, well, they must necessarily exist in order to actually be deceived. So those are those two arguments. And someone in the chat mentioned going over the infallibility slides again. So let's take a quick look. Let's see. All right, arguments to the best explanation. So let's just recap these. Um, now, yeah, I'm sorry that everyone's having audio issues. Well, not everyone. Some of you are having audio issues. I wish I could be more help with that sort of thing. Um, so I know that we covered this slide fairly well, right? Descartes does borrow this idea. After all, Descartes is sort of trained in the Jesuit tradition. So um, the idea of infallibility is already there within Catholicism. Um, this idea had begun to come into question thanks in part to figures like Martin Luther. And maybe Descartes and others like him are correct when they say that infallibility is sufficient for knowledge. When a belief is infallible, that is, it cannot be shown to be false, then you've got enough to say that your belief counts as an instance of knowledge. But is infallibility necessary for a belief to count as knowledge? Crumley claims that a Cartesian skeptic would not be able to demonstrate that this is so, right? And there's even a group, a sort of an approach to epistemology called fallibilism. So somebody who's a fallibilist thinks that even if there is the possibility that you are mistaken, you may still have knowledge. Your beliefs may still count as instances of knowledge. And what we have to do here is only rule out relevant alternative scenarios, not every possible alternative scenario. So sure, it's possible that I'm dreaming or that I'm being deceived by an evil genius or something. But how relevant are these? I mean, they're very strong skeptical arguments, but are they likely to be true? Probably not, right? So that's what a fallibilist would say. The last slide is the slide that we didn't really get a chance to cover that much. Well, what am I doing here? Descartes is not a fallibilist because his criteria, his epistemic criterion, is that his beliefs are infallible, right? He uses the word indubitable a lot, but he doesn't mean that that he doesn't want to find things that are impossible to doubt, really, as we would say in modern day English. What he wants is to find a belief that it is impossible to show is false. And he thinks he's found that with the cogito. I think, therefore I am. So as long as he's thinking, he can be certain he exists. Even if he's being deceived, he can be certain he exists, right? So Descartes' not a fallibilist. A fallibilist would be somebody who says Descartes' epistemic criteria are perhaps too strict, right? You might have knowledge even if you could be mistaken, if you haven't ruled out the possibility that you have been mistaken. What's important is that you rule out relevant ways in which you might be mistaken. Like, I mean, I might be mistaken about what time it is because I'm looking at a broken clock, but I'm probably not mistaken about what time it is because aliens have abducted me and put me into a sophisticated simulation to study me. And the simulation has clocks that represent time such that they never show me what time it actually is, right? So skepticism, it means to inquire, or in a sort of modern sense, to doubt. But infallibility is just an epistemic criterion. So that means it's something that some epistemologists would say is necessary or sufficient for a belief to count as knowledge. So skepticism is to inquire, um, um, to ask questions, really to doubt, and see if your beliefs survive the process of doubting, right? That's essentially what Descartes is doing. But Descartes has very stringent epistemic criteria, like infallibility. So that would be the main difference there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is what Feldman says about the fallibilist's position. He says, our experiences provide us with very good evidence, but not absolutely conclusive evidence for propositions that we really do see a book, for example, and thus are not dreaming. The evidence is good enough to justify our ordinary beliefs and thus to satisfy the justification conditions, a standard or requirement for knowledge. All the arguments for skepticism rely on the mistaken assumption that justification and thus knowledge require conclusive evidence. So maybe we just need evidence that's good enough. It doesn't have to be infallible or absolutely conclusive. We just need it to be good enough, right? So skeptics face some other counter arguments as well. Some skeptics, for example, would say that there might be just as much evidence for any number of rival explanations as there is for our common sense way of looking at the world. And what that means, our common sense way of looking at the world is our view that, there is actually an external world out there full of objects like books and desks and windows and other people and so on. So a skeptic would say, like, you don't have any more evidence for believing that than for some rival theory, like that you're a brain in a vat and we live in a simulation or something, right? And that's true. But you can reply to that by saying, well, there might still be a best explanation. So maybe the explanation that's best supported by the evidence is that we really do live in a world that's a bit like our common sense view, where there are objects out there in an external world that actually exist. There are other people with other minds out there, which actually exist. That's a better explanation than something like we live in the Matrix, because it's more reasonable and it's equally supported by the evidence, but it's perhaps more reasonable, right? So in that case, we would be making an argument for the best explanation. We would say that the best explanation is the one that's most likely to be true. And we'll talk a little bit more about arguments to the best explanation today, because we're going to get into a little bit about inductive reasoning. When we talk about David Hume. So let's do that. Let's talk about Hume. So here's a painting of David Hume by Alan Ramsey, wearing a funny hat. A lot of philosophers wore funny hats back in the day. So Hume lived from 1711 to 1776. He was a Scottish philosopher, and he is an empiricist. So that means that he argues that knowledge comes from sense experience. Sure, we can reason things out deductively if we want. He's not saying that we can't do that. It's just that primarily knowledge comes from the senses. You can make deductive arguments about bachelors and triangles and stuff, but we acquire these very concepts thanks to sense experience. So where Descartes is a rationalist, which means that knowledge comes from the intellect, Hume is an empiricist. Knowledge comes from the senses. Perhaps his most famous work is called A Treatise of Human Nature. Now, Hume has some skeptical worries, but they're quite different from those of Descartes. Um, he thinks that we can actually know quite a lot of things. But if we want to take credit for it, there's a problem, right? We get if we claim that we arrive at knowledge because we rely on some method, the right kind of method, say something like the scientific method, well, then we ought to be able to provide good reasons for using that method. This is another way of saying that we ought to always have good reasons for believing the things that we do. And this includes having good reasons for using the methods that we use to arrive at our rational beliefs. But if you were to, Hume would say, if you were to ask somebody to provide good reasons for why we rely on a particular method, a particular scientific method or philosophical method, Hume would say we actually cannot provide any such reasons. Yeah, go back one slide. Keep in mind, you don't have to be jotting down notes like of anything that's written on the slides, just in case any of you are scrambling to keep up with the slides. The slides are there. You can add notes to them, but copying just what's already written here might slow some people up, right? So, but here and on the next slide, just the gist of this is just that you want to, yeah. Also, yeah, the slides are shared on Brightspace. You can just open them up. The Abdullah, this is in the course outline. Um, and I also covered that on the first class. So yeah, it's going to be a mix of stuff. I wouldn't worry about the exam right now. We have to worry about learning stuff that will be on the exam. So one of the things will certainly be skepticism. So, okay, if we claim that we get things right because we rely on a method, we should be able to explain why we rely on the method. And we can't do that. We cannot provide good reasons uh, for why we rely on the methods to generate the beliefs that we say are rational. Sure, Hume would say, like, yeah, we do get a lot of things right. We use various methods, and we do get a lot of things right. We do have a lot of true beliefs. We're naturally inclined to do this, right? Not just humans, but other non-human animals are naturally inclined to certain beliefs, many of which turn out to be true. But we can't take credit for it. We're not rationally entitled to those beliefs. That's Hume's argument. But Hume has a particular method in mind when he's saying all of this, right? He's not talking about something like the scientific method, like you will have learned in school. He's talking about induction, inductive reasoning. So, what is induction all about? Well, induction or inductive inference is trying to show that its conclusions are probable. It's different from deductive reasoning, right? Deductive arguments are supposed to be truth preserving. Yes, there is a Discord for this class. It's again, all this is in the course outline and covered in the first lecture. And yeah, you can find links to the helpful materials section on Brightspace, or links to the Discord thing there, as well as in the course outline. So deductive arguments are supposed to show that, or deductive arguments are supposed to be truth preserving, right? Um, so what's an example? No, not really. Um, at least if we're doing them right, we shouldn't be worried about that. Can we, good reason for holding our beliefs when we cannot. No, Hume argues that we can't have those good. We just can't have the good reasons. It's not that we can't say what the reasons are. There are no good reasons. We're just naturally inclined that way, but we can't rationally justify any of our true beliefs. So, deductive arguments. Okay, relying on induction has led me to true beliefs. Yes, exactly. That's an argument that relies on the uniformity principle. But we'll get there. We'll get there. Um, so deductive arguments, truth preserving, right? What that means is if you follow the form of the argument properly, in other words, if your argument is valid, what we call valid, and if all of your premises are true, what we call a sound argument, then you're guaranteed to end up at the truth, right? Take, for example, the deductive syllogism, right? It has two premises and a conclusion. And there are lots of examples you could use, right? A kind of shop-worn example is premise one, all men are mortal. Premise two, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal, right? Very simple. So if the premises are true and you follow, if the premises are true and you follow the argument properly, you don't commit any fallacies or anything like that, you're guaranteed to arrive at the truth. That's deductive argument. Inductive inference is quite different. Inductive inference shows its conclusions are probable, not certain or logically necessary, right? And there's a few different kinds. So one is called enumerative induction. So here you're going out into the world and looking at whether members of a certain category or class of entities have properties in common with one another. Another sort of maybe overused example here is using enumerative induction to determine the color of swans. You know, maybe I'm out bird watching and I'm seeing all of these swans, and all of the swans are white. And I do this a bunch of times. Maybe I go on the internet and look at pictures of swans, and they're all white. And I go to various parks and ponds and lakes, and every swan I see is white. So I conclude on the basis that all of the swans I have seen are white, that all swans must be white in color. If I was doing that, I'd be using an enumerative induction, right? And there's also an argument or inference to the best explanation. This is called abduction. Let's say I went downstairs in the morning, maybe I'm getting ready to teach, and I find that one of my houseplants has been knocked over. There's soil everywhere. The plant is out of its pot and so forth. I conclude that the best explanation for my plant being, knocked over and all over the floor is that one of my cats must have knocked it over. Why is it the best explanation? Well, it's simpler than other potential explanations. For example, maybe a poltergeist knocked it over, or maybe there are gremlins in my apartment, or some aliens invaded my apartment and knocked the plant over. Sure, I mean, I guess those are possible, maybe. But it's far more likely that my cats were just playing around at night and accidentally knocked the plant over. So that would be using abduction, argument to the best explanation, or an argument that best fits the facts as you've observed them. So that's what induction is all about. And those are the two sort of main ways that we can think of it. And so Hume thinks that we're naturally inclined to many beliefs that we arrive at via induction, even though we're not rationally entitled to these beliefs. So why am I not rationally entitled to those beliefs? That's what we have to explain. Yes, exactly. That's right, Victoria. Enumerative induction and abduction, or inference to the best explanation, are types of induction because we're going out there and observing things and trying to argue what is probably the case, not what is definitely the case, right? Exactly right. Enumeration numbers, that one's easy to remember. Abduction, best explanation. That's exactly right. So why am I not entitled to beliefs like this? Like it's perfectly natural, Hume would say, if you were to believe that when you step out of a room or an apartment or a house, that the rooms, the apartment, the objects within are going to continue to exist, even if you step outside. Um, that's it's perfectly natural, but you're just not entitled, rationally speaking, to hold such a belief. And that might sound absolutely ridiculous to you, but it's not, right? It's actually not. And I'll explain why. So we'll go to the next slide. Here's what Hume says. He says, it seems evident that men are carried by natural instinct or prepossession to repose faith in their senses, and that without any reasoning, or even almost before the use of reason, we always suppose an external universe which depends not on our perception, but would exist, though we and every sensible creature were absent or annihilated. Even the animal creations are governed by a like opinion and preserve this belief of external objects in all their thoughts, designs, and actions. So, um, Hume is making a pretty strong claim here. Not only are we naturally inclined to think that there is a world out there that exists independently of anyone perceiving it, even non human animals are like this too, right? And if you have a pet, you can actually try this. You can see if your pet has object permanence, if they are aware that things still exist, even if they can't see them. I've tried it with my cats and my dog, and they both seem to understand that objects continue to exist even when they can't see them. Not babies, though. Human babies are bad at it. Um, So we basically need a rational method, and that method needs to be good so we can explain how we got to our belief. Yeah, yeah, that's what we would need to say that our beliefs are rationally justified, according to Hume. And it's also the thing that we don't have. And I'll show you why he says that. So now Hume says belief in past experiences are justified as well as beliefs in present circumstances. So my belief in my belief that I taught this class on Monday is justified because it happened. I did it, right? It's likewise reasonable for me to believe that I am currently teaching this class, right? But am I rationally justified when it comes to beliefs about the future? Am I rationally justified in claiming that I will certainly teach this class next week? Well, no. I might get sick and I might have to cancel class, right? Am I rationally justified in claiming that the sun will rise tomorrow? I'm actually not, right? Why not? Well, it's not logically necessary that the sun is going to rise. Something could happen. Maybe a different kind of evil genius creates a device which blocks out the sun. Maybe the sun explodes and doesn't rise. Maybe I take a sudden trip to the Arctic Circle or something where it's dark for 6 months out of the year. So technically, in morning, the sun wouldn't rise, right? It's not logically necessary. Yeah, maybe it's the aliens that are responsible. Um, yes, yeah, exactly. If I think that the sun is always going to rise in the morning, it's because in the past it always has. But um, when it comes to the future, there's nothing necessary about cause and effect, is what Hume is basically saying. Yeah, we know the past and we know the present, but we can't know the future with certainty. That's because when it comes to cause and effect, there's no necessary relationship between cause and effect, only a constant conjunction between cause and effect. So we could schematize this as follows if we wanted to. So all observed A's have been followed by B's. So all mornings have been, all early mornings have been followed by a sunrise or something like that. Assuming morning starts, at 12 a.m. or 3 a.m., whatever you want to do. An A is currently being observed, therefore B will follow. So I wake up in the morning, excuse me, before sunrise, see the time on my alarm clock. It's morning, and then the sun rises. So why believing, what he wants to know is, why does believing in 1 and 2 entitle us to believe in 3? Why does believing that all A's have been followed by B's and that I'm currently observing an A license my belief in B about to follow? That means to do this, to make a sort of schematic out of the argument, to sort of make a general framework, not anything specific. See, philosophers do this kind of like mathematicians use variables, right? My A and my B here in this argument can mean whatever I want them to be. So that's what I'm doing. Kind of like what a mathematician would do with the variables that can stand in for any number. So I could do this with anything, right? All maybe I'm maybe I'm talking about something completely different. All observed car accidents have been followed, or all observed dangerous driving has been followed by a car accident. I'm currently observing some dangerous driving, therefore a car accident will follow, right? Yeah, 3 would be the expectation that the sun would rise right now if it's morning. So uh, all early mornings have been followed by a beautiful sunrise, perhaps. So I'm getting up and currently observing that it's morning just before sunrise. Therefore, the sun is about to rise. But there's nothing that rationally entitles me to believe in 3, to believe in that conclusion. I'm just naturally inclined to rely on this conjunction, this constant conjunction between cause and effect, right? We can see why this doesn't work if we compare inductive reasoning to deductive reasoning, right? Here's a deductive argument called modus ponens, and it has this form, right? If P, then Q. So if P, then Q, you observe P, therefore Q. That's what you conclude. So this is kind of general. Let's make it more specific. If it rains a lot in the spring, if it rains a lot in the spring, the Ottawa experimental farm will have a good science corn crop and growing all kinds of stuff there for science. So if they get a lot of rain, maybe they'll have a lot of corn. So if P is raining a lot in the spring and Q is the crop of corn, I observe Q is true, or P is true. It rains a lot in the spring. Therefore, I can conclude that Q is true. The Ottawa experimental farm will have a good science corn crop. Go ahead, Brooke.
Hi, so I know you're explaining this, but in the textbook, it gave something really similar to this as a form of induction. So now I'm like, oh, I don't know if can I tell you the example and you let me know if it's
Yeah,
induction?
do you want to point us to the page number where that example
Yeah.
is?
Um, sorry, I have it in my notes. So I'm not too sure where I found it. I'll find it after and I'll put it in the chat, but it says in the past, whenever I've heard the sound of the chime, I have subsequently experienced someone at the front door. 2, I am
Mm-hmm.
currently hearing the sound of the chime. 3, thus I will find someone at the front door. So now I'm a
Yeah,
little confused if that's induction or deduction.
it's induction because
Okay.
Well, I mean, it's induction because the example is based around the character Jethro's observations and what he does with them, right? The form of the argument is very similar to modus ponens, right? But modus, like if P then Q, P therefore Q, is the form of a deductive argument, an argument that's designed to be truth preserving, right? Like you could have like literally a bunch of nonsense such that the argument isn't sound and it would still be valid. It would still be logically valid. So for example, something like um and also it's similar in form to modus ponens, but it's not actually modus ponens, because if you notice in the first premise, it's not if then, right? This is just a syllogism. So in the past, when there's been a thing, there's been another thing that follows. There's been an A that's been followed by a B, a chime followed by someone at the door. But it's not like an if then sort of statement. So it's just a regular old syllogism. Um, well, it's not. That's yeah. It could be thought of as a hypothesis, but that's not really the point, right? The point is that um, we're using a certain form of argument, a certain form of deductive argument here. It's not even important what the example is about. What's important is the structure of the argument, right? If it rains a lot in the spring, the farm will have a good crop. It rained a lot in the spring, therefore there's a good crop, right? But you could sub in, like I was about to say, you could put in a bunch of nonsense here and the argument would still be valid. It just wouldn't be sound. So if P then Q. So if let's see, what can we come up with nonsense? What kind of nonsense can we come up with that is still logically valid? If it rains today, then I will become a hamburger. So if P then Q. Yeah, the doorbell is enumerative induction. That's right. Yeah, it's not deduction. So if P then Q, if it rains today, then I will become a hamburger. P, it rains today. Q, I am a hamburger. But I'm not a hamburger, obviously, right? So that's still a valid form of argument, but it's not sound, right? So my conclusion can't be true because my premises aren't true, even though I followed the proper form. Um, so yeah, like I've been saying, modus ponens and other deductive arguments. No. Okay. No, I've got to slow down here. How could I say what? Let me go up to Daisy's comment. The conclusion is not inductive. We're using deduction here. The conclusion it's usually one sort of reasoning or the other, right? Um, well, what I'm saying is that it's absurd that I should become a hamburger when it rains, right? So what I'm saying is that even though the premises are not true and the conclusion is not true, deductive arguments are still truth preserving. So you can have a valid argument, but if it's not sound, it doesn't work, right? It's not about going out and looking whether people become hamburgers when it rains, right? Um, so would any deductive arguments be valid in Hume's view? Yeah, deductive arguments are great. For Hume thinks they're great. It's just we kind of like where I
There's
think.
dust everywhere.
Oop, oh, there's a microphone on there.
Your phone. Yeah. Oh my God.
So so deductive
Do you
arguments
take
are.
allergy medication? Oh,
So deductive arguments are valid. Hume is not saying that they're not. What he is saying is that we seem to tacitly rely on what we think is something like a rational principle that tells us that the future will be like the past. But that's not actually rationally justified. So we'll get there. We'll get there. No, Hume would allow that we could very well be right that if it receives a lot of rain, we'll have a good crop of corn. He could be absolutely right about that. You could be absolutely correct. But you're just not rationally entitled to the belief, right? Well, it's about reasoning from premises to a conclusion. It's not necessarily about ruling out possibilities. It's so yeah, that's what I'm doing, what I'm attempting to do now. Modus ponens and other deductive arguments are truth preserving. So you start with what matters is the structure that you're using of the argument. So modus ponens is a particular form of argument which is valid. And if you have true premises and you follow the form of the argument correctly, you're guaranteed to arrive at a true conclusion. But induction is more about like looking at the world and saying what is probably true based on what you observe, right? That's what inductive reasoning is. So deductive arguments are about trying to reach a true premise or true conclusions from true premises by following a form of argument that's logically valid. But induction is like looking at the world. Deduction is kind of like, it's more similar to what a mathematician might do if they were generating a mathematical proof. And induction is more like what a scientist does when they observe the world and do an experiment. That might be a way to sort of crystallize the difference, right? But it's not really about like ruling out possibilities. It's about going from premises to a conclusion, right? So just to get back here, yeah. So deductive arguments are really great because they're truth preserving. I mean, sure, you can have an argument that maybe follows a valid form. Maybe the premises aren't true, so you don't get to a true conclusion. But if you make sure that the premises are true, you're going to arrive at the truth. What we want to ask is whether there's a similar license to believe for belief when it comes to inductive reasoning. So is there something that entitles us to believe, for example, that constant conjunctions between A's and B's in the past will also occur in the future, right? Is there something similar to a deductive argument that would license our belief in because there's always been a constant conjunction between the sun rising in the morning in the past, that licenses our belief that the sun will rise in the future? That's what Hume is asking. Now, Hume is saying that when we rely on inductive reasoning like this, we're relying on an unstated principle, a sort of tacit principle that we're maybe not consciously aware of. He says that instances of which we have had no experience must resemble those of which we have had experience, and that the course of nature continues always uniformly the same. That's the principle that we kind of always relying on, sort of unrelying assumption that nature is the same throughout the whole universe, including in the future. So there's an unstated assumption where I'm relying on, if I'm concluding on the basis that the sun always rises in the morning, so in the future the sun will continue to rise in the morning. what I'm doing is relying on this unstated assumption that nature will be the same. The future will be like the present or the past. And this is what we call nowadays the uniformity principle. So what Hume is saying is that when we try to explain inferences like B will follow A, you know, sunrise will always follow the early morning hours, we're always sort of tacitly relying on a principle like the uniformity principle. Now, Hume is not saying that we ought to rely on this principle. He's just saying that we naturally do. We are naturally inclined to think, among other things, that the future, which we have not experienced, will be like the past, which we have experienced. We're tacitly relying on the uniformity principle, even though we're not rationally justified in doing so. So let's see, how are we doing for time? Okay, pretty good, pretty good. So how can we justify a claim? Hume thinks there are two ways to justify a claim. Depends on what kind of claim we're dealing with. We've got claims, about different things, but they'll always either be about the world and the way the world is, or about concepts or definitions. Now, we use sense experience to justify claims about the world. So the sun will rise tomorrow. How do I justify that? Well, according to my sense experience, I've always seen the sun rising in the morning. And so if I tacitly rely on my, not just my sense experience, but I tacitly rely on the uniformity principle or something like it, I'm going to try and justify my belief that the sun will rise tomorrow that way. We use reason to justify claims about concepts and definitions. This is what, maybe is more deductive, right? Can we use either approach to justify reliance on the uniformity principle? Well, not really. Why? Let's take a look. If we wanted to justify the uniformity principle with reason, we'd have to show that it's a truth of reason, a logical truth, right? Like all triangles have three sides is a logical truth. Why? Because if you said that a triangle have four sides, well, that would be contradictory, right? It would be like finding a married bachelor. You're not going to find one because definitionally, bachelors are unmarried and triangles have three sides. So if we wanted to show that the uniformity principle if we wanted to justify the uniformity principle by reason, we'd have to show it's a logical truth. And to show it's a logical truth, we have to show that by denying denying the uniformity principle is contradictory. But let's try that. The uniformity principle states that nature is everywhere the same, so the future will resemble the past. But the proposition, the denial of uniformity principle, the proposition that the future will not resemble the past is not self-contradictory, right? I mean, if the future were to not resemble the past in very important, very salient ways, maybe the world would become a confusing, messy place, right? But it's not logically self-contradictory. So if the sun stopped rising in the morning, that would be a case of the future not resembling the past. And it would be weird if it happened, but it's not self-contradictory. And even in a weaker sense, like, of course, the future resembles the past in some important ways, but also the future doesn't resemble the past in other ways, right? New things happen. The future resembles the past, in the sense that we're all still living on the planet Earth, but life in the 21st century is certainly much different than life in the first century. So it's not contradictory to say that the future will not resemble the past. So we can't show that denying the universe, the uniformity principle is self-contradictory. It's just not self-contradictory. So the uniformity principle is not a logical truth, like all triangles have three sides. It's not the same kind of thing as all triangles have three sides or all bachelors are unmarried. What about justifying reliance on the uniformity principle with experience? Well, that might proceed like this. Maybe premise one is reliance on the uniformity principle in the past has led to true beliefs. Yeah, okay. And we can rely on the past. We can be certain of what's happened in the past. Hume is fine with that. Premise two, I am relying on the uniformity principle now. Okay. So I've relied on the uniformity principle in the past. It's led to true beliefs. I'm relying on it in the present. Therefore, in the future, it will lead to a true belief. But hang on. This is the very inference pattern that we wanted to defend or establish in the first place. I mean, if we try to justify the uniformity principle what we're doing is presuming that the future will be like the past. But that's the thing we're trying to establish in the first place, right? It's like if I asked you, how do you know with certainty the future will be like the past? And you said, well, the future's always been like the past in the past. Like, well, that's fine. But what if it doesn't turn out that way? And you might say, I'm relying on this principle um, that says that the future will be like the past. Well, now we're right back to square one. How do you know? How do you know the future will be like the past? I'm relying on a principle that says the future will be like the past. Yeah, but this is prior to science, right? I mean, this is a good point. Uh, we know this. We're probably right about it, but Hume is going to say that we're not rationally entitled to that belief because this is all induction. And how do we know that induction will continue to work? Well, it's continued to work in the past. Well, I mean, this all turns on the uniformity principle. So if we want to, um, if the uniformity principle says that the future will be like the past, and we want to justify our belief that the future will be like the past because in the past the future has been like the past, what we're doing is called begging the question. It's a form of it's like an informal fallacy where the conclusion that you're trying to prove actually features as a premise in your argument. So and it's a sort of circular argument. So does everybody see what I mean so far about the problems with the uniformity principle? Like, firstly, the uniformity principle says that nature is uniformly the same, such that the future will be like the past. Um, that's the uniformity principle. Now, I want to license my my beliefs that are based on this principle, rationally license them. So I have to show that the uniformity principle is either a truth of reason, or I can justify it with my experience. But denying UP is not self-contradictory. Like saying the future will not be like the past is not the same as saying there's a triangle with four sides, right? A triangle with four sides just isn't a triangle. But there's nothing self-contradictory about saying the future will not be like the past, logically speaking, right? So maybe I can do it with experience, right? In the past, reliance on this principle has led to true belief, and I'm relying on it now. So in the future, it will lead to a true belief. But I'm trying to justify induction using induction. So that's why it's circular. Everybody following me? I'll wait until maybe, yeah, okay, good, good, good. Well, it depends on the ways in which we're talking about it resembling the past, I think. Another instance of begging the question? Yeah, I can do that. So imagine that well, Descartes actually commits this fallacy too. We haven't read this yet, but we may take a look at it when in the last chapter when we talk about oh, excuse me, when we talk about arguments for the existence of God. So Descartes says, I know that God exists because I have a clear and distinct idea of God in the intellect. How can I trust my clear and distinct ideas? Well, God, unlike the evil genius, is not a deceiver. So there's another circle there. It's called the Cartesian circle, in fact. Like it's like I can trust my clear and distinct ideas because God wouldn't deceive me. And I know God exists because I have clear and distinct ideas of God. They each support one another, but there's no getting outside of that. There's no other external support for either of those claims. So that's like another circular argument. Um, Well, I guess if you're talking about Satan, originally Satan is actually just part of the heavenly court, right? Like in the book of Job, Satan's just doing his job. Um, the idea that Satan is a deceiver actually comes a little bit later in Judeo-Christian history. The Cartesian circle. Yeah, I'll repeat that. So Descartes knows he can know things in part because he's got these clear and distinct ideas. Whenever he grasps something clearly and distinctly in the intellect, he knows it's true. And he has a clear and distinct idea of God. So he says he can be certain that God exists. But how can he trust his clear and distinct ideas? Well, God wouldn't deceive him. God is like the guarantor of the accuracy and trustworthiness of his clear and distinct ideas. So it's a circle, right? I know God exists because I have this clear and distinct idea of God, and I can trust my clear and distinct ideas because God wouldn't deceive me. That's fine, but it's a circle. And you need to get outside of that circle to establish whether either of those are actually true, right? That's the Cartesian circle. The uniformity principle, it might be rational. Um, we're not rationally justified in relying on it, is what Hume is claiming. But some disagree. I mean, we're going to get there. Peter Strawson disagrees with Hume. Peter Strawson says, "What are you talking about, Hume? It's perfectly reasonable to think that the future will resemble the past, right?" Yeah, exactly. Like a simpler example, and I'm not trying to be provocative when I use this example, but if you've ever had an argument with like a religious apologist, somebody who a defender of the faith, they might say that, you know, I know God exists because ultimately God is the author of this holy book. Well, how can you trust the holy book? Well, because God wrote it. So it says in this holy book that God exists. How do you know? Well, you know, God is like the author of it, and it says he exists, and it's a circle. It's begging the question. So the same thing is going on here with our reliance on the uniformity principle. Yeah, like when you want some kind of outside justification, right? In any when you're trying to establish anything is true. If you're going in a circle, it's a sign that something is wrong and you need to kind of reevaluate your argument. I don't know about that. I mean, we'll talk about this a lot more when we get to arguments for God's existence, but I mean, um I mean, assuming that God does not exist, plenty of people live their lives that way anyway. Yeah. Uh, I don't think that arguments for God in philosophy are tricky. A lot of them are just ontological. A lot of them are very sort of like trying. A lot of them aim at showing that God necessarily exists, um, like in a sort of logical way, which is fine, but that doesn't guarantee that that's actually the way the universe is, right? Um, Yeah, and I mean, looking at the bigger picture, I mean, I'm not talking about on an individual basis either. I think that it's while it's true that lots of people live their lives without sort of belief in the divine, um, they're going to have a very different set of fundamental assumptions about what the world is like without God than somebody who believes in God. Um, and the problem is that in debates like this, they end up talking past one another, right? Um, so, what would the world be like without God? If you ask a Christian or a Muslim or somebody, they would say, oh, it would be a horrible place. But if you ask an atheist, they would say, what are you talking about? It would be exactly like it is right now because God does not exist, right? That's what where the sort of talking past one another comes, right? Because there are different fundamental assumptions. Objective morality, it's not clear whether that is a thing. And I'm no relativist, right? But that's something that the religious, I would say, and again, I'm not trying to be provocative, but religious answers about morality are often unsatisfying to a philosopher. Um, but we'll get into this later in the class when we talk about uh, uh, when we talk about that. Because the argument is circular. That yeah, that's why it can't be well verified. Subjective morality. I mean, again, like this is kind of really more to do with what we'll be talking about in toward the last week with arguments for the existence of God. And one of the arguments against the existence of God is the problem of evil. One of the arguments for the existence of God has to do with God being the sort of source of morality. But again, someone who believes in God is going to be working with a fundamentally different set of assumptions than someone who doesn't. So it's often claimed by religious people that if there was no God, everyone would be evil or something. But that's probably not true. And I'm not trying to tip my hand here, but the ancient Greek philosophers, for example, were very concerned with morality and ethics and living a good life, and they were not monotheists. In fact, their gods were arguably horrible people, right? Well, I mean, they weren't people, but they were terrible. They were fallible. They would do evil things. The Greeks wanted to know what was good and evil using reason. Um, I don't know about that. I think that there would be some who disagree with you. Although, again, you go back to the book of Job and all this horrible stuff is being done to Job. It's God who's doing it, not Satan, right? Um, so this is a discussion for later. Getting back to this, yeah, we can't show that the uniformity principle is um, is like a rational principle because when we deny it, it's not actually self-contradictory to deny it. And we can't justify it with experience because we'd be using induction to justify using induction. So it's a circle, right? So we don't want a circle. So what Hume is saying is where this leaves us is that our inductive inferences are never rationally justified. We can't ever claim that we have good reasons for our beliefs. Our beliefs might be right, but we're not entitled to say that they're rational, right? Which is, it sounds crazy, but it's not. It's not really. But you don't have to agree with it. Maybe Hume's standards of rationality are just way too strict here. Peter Strawson, 20th century philosopher, says this. He says, it is an analytic proposition, a proposition that is true by definition, whose denial is an implicit self-contradiction, like a four-sided triangle or a married bachelor, right? An analytic proposition is like that. If you denied it, it would be self-contradictory. So it's an analytic proposition that it is reasonable to have a degree of belief in a statement which is proportional to the strength of the evidence in its favor. And it is an analytic proposition that, other things being equal, the evidence for a generalization is strong in proportion as the number of favorable instances and the variety of circumstances in which they have been found is great. So to ask whether it is reasonable to place reliance on inductive procedures is like asking whether it is reasonable to proportion the degree of one's convictions to the strength of the evidence. Doing this is what being reasonable means in such a context. So here, Strawson is saying that, well, okay, but it's analytic. It's like saying all triangles have three sides. Similarly, what are the exact words here? It's reasonable to place reliance on inductive procedures. It's the same thing as saying it's reasonable to proportion the degree of your convictions to the strength of the evidence. He takes that as a very reasonable thing to say. Denying it would be self-contradictory. Like saying you found a four-sided triangle, it would be unreasonable to say it would be reasonable not to proportion the degree of convictions to the strength of the evidence, right? That would be self-contradictory. So of course, this is fine. This is fine for Strawson. Rationality is not subjective, actually. That's what logic is all about. Sure, people can be manipulated, people can be misled, but there are proper ways of reasoning, and that's what logic is all about. Logic is the study of proper reasoning. And there are correct ways to reason, like modus ponens is a logically valid form of inference, but there are incorrect ways of reasoning, and these are formal and informal logical fallacies. So, and how do we know? Well, we know because logic is a formal system, almost like mathematics, right? If you do the calculations correctly in mathematics, you get the right answer. If you follow a deductive argument correctly and all of your premises are true, you're guaranteed to arrive at a true conclusion. So rationality is not subjective. There are right answers to things. Yes, you can be wrong. You could make a mistake or commit an error of reasoning, but that does not mean that rationality itself is subjective. Do you see what I mean? I'll take it as a yes. But yeah, that's why I mentioned what I did before in the previous class. I think a lot of people come into philosophy with with a sort of relativistic framework. Well, reason and rationality, the same thing. Same thing. I mean, like proper reasoning. But to answer your question, Victoria, what being reasonable means to Strawson is to proportion your conviction to a claim or proposition or belief to the strength of the evidence. So the more evidence you have for a belief, the more okay it is for you to have that belief, the more certainty you have. What Strawson is saying is that denying that, trying to, would be self-contradictory. It would be like saying, there is a four-sided triangle or a married bachelor. That's what he means when he says that it's an analytic proposition. So Hume is like, oh, induction. Well, if we try and use induction to justify use of the uniformity principle, that's circular reasoning. That's begging the question. But Strawson is saying, hang on, it's saying that you should do the opposite of proportioning the strength of your convictions to the proportion of evidence. That would be like saying you have a four-sided triangle. It does not make sense, right? Proportioning the strength of our beliefs to the strength of the evidence is exactly what being reasonable means in a context like this. I don't think you're too far off the mark there, actually. Yeah, Bayes' theorem, the probability that a hypothesis is true, based on the strength of the evidence. Yeah, I'd say you're right to point out a similarity there. I'm not sure anything that Strawson is actually influenced by Bayes here, but I think that you're correct to identify that similarity for sure. Okay, so we're running low on time, so let's try and finish up here. Strawson kind of takes a slightly different approach in later works, saying our inescapable natural commitment is to a general frame of belief and to a general style, the inductive, of belief formation. To respond to Hume, what this means is to respond to Hume, what we really have to do is illustrate how induction plays a role in belief formation and belief change, show that it's a fundamental means of engaging with the world. Notice that this means that here, in a certain important way, Hume and Strawson would actually agree with one another. Namely that it's perfectly natural for us to rely on inductive reasoning for belief formation or belief change. And they both agree that we can't really provide any argument against a skeptic who claims induction is not rationally justified. I mean, Strawson is not really rationally justifying inductive reasoning here. He does say it's somewhat reasonable in the context that we use it in, though. So Hume says reason can't guarantee the efficacy of induction. Strawson disagrees with that within the context that we use it, namely existing in the world and forming beliefs on the basis of what we experience. And toward the end of the chapter, Crumley points out further that induction doesn't just take place in a vacuum, right? It takes place in the context of other beliefs. And this context could license or prohibit other beliefs. And we're always learning new facts and acquiring new concepts, right? When you learn about what birds are, you learn that they're feathered flying creatures that evolved from dinosaurs, or more technically, according to, I think, the most up-to-date paleontology, that they simply are dinosaurs. But then as you learn more about birds, you go to the zoo and you see birds that can't fly, like ostriches or penguins, and you modify your system of beliefs on the basis of those observations. So, birds, like every bird I've ever observed flies, therefore all birds fly. Well, until you meet a penguin, and then you realize that not all birds fly, right? So Hume perhaps is misdescribing our cognitive situation when it comes to induction, right? I have already all these beliefs that I formed on the basis of sense experience. They're all related to one another, and moreover, I can change them. Now, whether I adopt a new belief, and whether I'm licensed to have that belief, whether I'm rationally justified in that new belief, might depend in some way on the background of all my other beliefs, right? Any questions before we wrap up? We've only got about 4 more minutes, so So if anyone has any questions about Hume or about Descartes or anything like that, I'll take your questions for the next 4 minutes. Oh, thanks, Brooke. Brennan, what does rational entitlement mean? It means, does reason permit me to have the belief that I have? Like, do I have good reasons for my belief? Right? That's the thing that Hume wants us, or it would be nice if we could say we have good reasons, we can provide good reasons for the beliefs that we have. And what Hume is saying is, when it comes to inductive reasoning about the future, we can't do that. The main difference is that Hume is saying, Hume is making a very strong claim. We're just not rationally justified in believing that the future will be like the past. And Strawson is saying, like, well, no, in the context of the kinds of things we do and the kinds of creatures that we are, it is reasonable. So the strength of their claims is one difference, and whether it is reasonable or unreasonable to hold certain beliefs that have been arrived at via induction, they disagree about those things. Yeah. Still 2 more minutes in case anyone has a question. Yeah, I'll send reminders. Typically, I send reminders out, Michael, about quizzes and assignments. So usually what I'll do is I'll post an announcement on Brightspace, reminding everybody that a particular assignment or something is coming up. So I will be doing that. But don't forget to take a look at your course outline, because the course outline has all of the due dates already in there. So if you're not sure, or if you ever forget, you can always just go over to the course outline and take a peek, and the answer will be there. But do keep an eye out for announcements. Yeah, Strawson thinks that, you know, forming beliefs proportional to the strengths of evidence is what being reasonable means. So it's not unreasonable to suppose the sun would rise tomorrow because it's risen every day. It's not unreasonable. It's not rationally justified, but it's not like you're insane for believing the sun will rise, right? No, I don't like I don't like to do trick questions. Yeah, we're being reasonable. It's just that our particular beliefs are not rationally justified like beliefs arrived at via deductive arguments are. It's very nuanced. I've got to admit, the difference seems to me to be quite nuanced. So some of you may agree with Hume, some maybe more with Strawson. But yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I'm glad you yeah, email or pop in the Discord server, or reread it is always good. It takes a bit. I mean, I remember when I was learning this stuff, it's tricky the first time you go through it to assimilate these new concepts. It can be tricky. So thanks, everyone. If you have any questions, email me, and I will see you all on Monday. Take care.